Okay. Very good. Well, it is 11 o'clock, and I do want to welcome everybody that's both here as well as online to the Watts of Yesteryear, electric cars from the early 20th century. In the past, we've done a webinar or two about electrification, and when we were setting up programs for this year, it was asked whether we could do something on the early 1900s. And so we have a great speakers today. Not only do we have an author on a leading book on electrification of the American automobile and vehicles, but we also have 4 museums represented. And so you'll hear from a number of speakers, and the individuals from those museums will share something about their particular cars that are in their collection. And so let me, oh, there we go. And so you'll see that the electric vehicle revolution, which was written by Kevin Wilson, he is online, and so he'll be sharing some basic history and background on really how prevalent electric vehicles were in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then from there, Daniel Carpenter is going to share with us about their collection at the Tampa Bay Museum. After that, Sam Fiorani is going to share a little bit about the Boyertown Museum and their vehicles. And just directly off to my left is a vehicle that they have loaned us. And he'll share some stories about that and other cars in their collection. We have Andy Beckman, who is going to be speaking on behalf of the Studebaker Museum and share their history. And then lastly, we're excited to have Matt Anderson from the Henry Ford Museum, and he's going to be speaking about Clara Ford's electric car. She was not, for her own transportation, she really wasn't interested in having a Model T. And so he's going to share with us that, which I think is really quite exciting. And so this will be the order that we go in. First, Kevin, in terms of an overview, then Daniel Carpenter, and then Sam, and then Andrew, and lastly, Matthew. We are going to ask that you hold your questions to the end, because we do have some time constraints, and in particular, one of our speakers needs, as soon as he's done, needs to head to the airport to catch a flight. So we appreciate your patience on that. I want to introduce Kevin Wilson, and actually we'll pass this around just so you can get a see. This is the Electric Vehicle Revolution by Kevin Wilson. Let's see. Yeah, it's a little sensitive, but Rob will pass that around to the gallery that's here. Kevin has been a well-known automotive writer for many years, going back to 1986. Did a lot of work for many years for Auto Week, and since then has been writing for Automobile when it was around, Car and Driver, Popular Mechanics, Road and Track. He's a member of the Society of Automotive Historians and chief judge of the Ypsilanti Orphan Car Show for more than 15 years. And so with that, we will welcome Kevin to kick things off. Kevin?
Good morning, John. Good morning, museum heads. I am wearing my shirt from the Ypsilanti Automotive Heritage Museum. That's where we run the Orphan Car Show. But let me explain these guys on your screen. I'm going to take you back before the 20th century for a while. Nikola Tesla and Thomas Parker are both sides of an interesting story about the 1880s. Tesla was starting to do his electrical, sort of a carnival show with sparks and lights and oohs and ahs. And Thomas Parker was an engineer in England who was doing the heavy duty on the ground work of electrifying streetlights and stringing wires through the cities of Bristol, Birmingham, and eventually London. And so this is sort of what I wanted to get at, was the sheer inventive, bubbling innovation period that we're talking about, that it was also about internal combustion engine cars and steam cars, and all these things were competing at the same time. And it's hard sometimes for us to put the news of what happened back then in the context of back then. It was a pretty wild time. There was a lot going on simultaneously in the 1880s. Parker eventually, it was as early as 1881, built an electric motor into a carriage, and is often credited as the first electric car. This is a French car from Jonto that set a land speed record just under 40 miles an hour in 1898. And we can go on to the next one if you want. And this is also 1898. And this is Ferdinand Porsche's electric car for Lohner, the Lohner Porsche Electromobile. I think the Germans spelled it with a K in Electromobile. And he did several. He did a hybrid car. He did a four-wheel drive version of this thing in 1898. By that time, there were actually quite a few electric car makers trying to sell things to the public. In the United States, the first electric that we saw was 1888. Mr. Morrison in Iowa had built an electric wagon that he also showed at the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893, and made something of a sensation. This Stanley steamer here is to remind us that these things were all happening at the same time, and to bring us sort of into the 20th century, which is the part we want to concentrate on. That's where the museum holdings are. In 1900, an off-cited figure by EV advocates today is that 38% of the 5,000 cars built were electric, which is true, but it is 5,000 cars. 38% market share is pretty impressive, but it's not a huge number of cars. But what was happening was, by 1902, 1903, there were large fleets of taxis and delivery vehicles on the streets of New York and major eastern cities, at least. This is talking about the competition among different varieties of cars. This was Walter Baker's Torpedo Kid. It's number 999 there in that photo. Today it kind of looks like a soapbox derby car, but compared to what else is on that field, it's pretty advanced. He went 100 miles an hour in that thing in 1902. And electric cars had an advantage in top speed. In 1900, a Riker Cabriolet competing against cars from Duryea and some other early internal combustion cars and steam cars won the first 50-mile race on a horse track in, I believe it was Rhode Island. So they were right in there in the mix all along, but they kind of hit their heyday in the late 1900s and the teens, into the 19 teens, with some mass production stuff. and the spread of electricity into the cities so that there was good access to charging technology. Can we move on there, John? Okay, here's Thomas Edison. He slung a electric motor and a battery into it looks like a wheelchair practically. Early on, he was an advocate for electricity early on, but not necessarily electric cars. He was very critical of the battery technology that was available at that time. Next one. But he did show his own battery technology at the World's Fair in 1904. These were big competitions among different kinds of technology. Things hadn't settled in yet. So there was a lot of salesmanship going on. Edison, and by then Tesla was working for George Westinghouse and what became General Electric, and famously electrocuted a horse and an elephant to demonstrate the danger of alternating current that Tesla and Westinghouse were promoting, which will be relevant in just a moment. Let's move forward. Here's Thomas Edison displaying his own battery technology in 1913, which is the year before. Let's move on. This is his battery technology. It's nickel, iron, and an alkaline electrolyte. It's more durable than lead acid, which had become much more common, and it's much less sensitive to how you treat it. Some of these have been around 100 years and revived. Compared to a lead acid battery, and what drove Edison crazy was if you overcharged the lead acid battery, you'd kill it. If you ran it completely flat, you'd kill it. And he was busy spreading power through cities, and he wanted to store electricity that his generators made. So he would buy a bunch of these lead acid batteries, and then in a week he'd have to buy them again, which was just crazy. So he, like much of Edison's technology, he didn't invent this particular chemistry, but he did perfect it. So let's move on a little. Here's a battery. This is over, hey Matt, this is over at the Automotive Hall of Fame. It may even be on loan from your museum. There's a cutaway of the Edison Electric, and then the next slide, they went 1,000 miles with this Bailey electric battery, proving its durability and rechargeability. One more. So Henry Ford and Thomas Edison were pretty good buddies. We know that. And in 1914, we saw in the New York Times a rather extensive article, maybe planted by Ford Motor Company promoters, of Henry saying that he and Thomas Edison were going to build an electric car. It would be much more affordable and much more durable than what was presently on the market, and produced that on assembly lines like Henry's Model Ts. And it still would be more expensive than a Model T, but he was very certain about how these plans were going to come together in 1915. Well, whatever other delays there were, famously, the Edison batteries weren't up to snuff for demonstration purposes. Whatever other delays came along, it didn't happen. And we don't have a good smoking gun about what actually happened, but there were factory delays, production delays, technology delays, and then came World War I, which actually sort of helped some of the electric car makers because fossil fuels became in shorter supply and more expensive. Let's move on. This is a charging station where we worry about infrastructure a lot now. One thing to remember about the early days of electricity in the cities is that DC power, which led the early electrification of cities, there was no long-range transmission of electric power. So they had to build stations within 4 miles of each other. A 4-mile radius around a station like this would light up a whole city, but it was not it wasn't going to stretch beyond that. So you had these sort of neighborhood electrical stations, and you could charge your cars there. Move on. And here's a charging station. A lot of these cars were being sold to wealthy people largely, and they would have their chauffeur drive it down to have it charged overnight. If you had an Edison battery, it might take longer than it would for a lead acid battery. But you could leave it on the charger and it wouldn't hurt the battery any. Let's move on. This is, they really had to mind closely the lead acid batteries. So this is just part of the technology for minding it. Let's move on. This is a home charging station, which you might nail together from a few pieces in your own backyard. And next one, this is a Edison battery pack. Notice that the battery box is just that, a box. There's a lot of wood going on still in these manufactured products. Move on. This is a Baker Electric. We saw Baker went 100 miles an hour. He also went 200 miles on a charge with his Baker Electrics. He was pretty advanced on the technology of the cars. He concentrated on efficiency and lightweighting, even as he was selling these cars to very wealthy people. The car here belongs to a fellow at Our Next Energy, a battery company in Novi. These cars had, well, there you go. They were shaft driven. Go on back to the Baker ad, please, John. They were shaft driven at a time when many people were still relying on chains. He had developed a gear drive for the rear axle, and he was very successful. Walter Baker out of Cleveland was the first big volume producer, and then he was soon overtaken by, I think, next shot. Next, that's the Budva's. It's just that they sell these things to very wealthy people. Next one, that's the ad. And they went 200 miles on a single charge. Mind you, he was averaging 12 miles an hour driving around inside a city. So at 12 miles an hour to reach 200 miles, your driver had to have a lot more endurance than the Edison batteries even. Next slide. This is the Anderson Electric Car Company, manufacturer of Detroit Electrics in downtown Detroit. Anderson had been a carriage builder up in Port Huron, moved to Detroit with the boom in automotive production here, and established in 1907. Between 1907 and as late as 1939, Detroit Electrics were built. They were the biggest production volume was all of 16,000 over that long period, I think. But they were very, very successful because they were in prominent places. The owners of not only Ford Motor Company, but also Pierce Arrow and Packard, and their wives owned those Detroit Electric cars. Let's move on.
Well, not now. He was on before.
So this is an ad from
He
Flanders.
started right at 11.
I just wanted
He
to.
started right at 11.
I'm sorry. I'm being interrupted somehow.
Oh,
This Flanders ad, I wanted to just point out that it includes a line from, it says, a fitting companion for your Packard, Pierce, or other limousine or touring car. Your garage is incomplete without a Flanders Electric as auxiliary to your gasoline equipment. This is 1913, and they've already pretty much conceded the market for mass market cars to gasoline cars. And I wanted to just read you, this is sort of the end of why I think electric cars faded out. As early as 1916, a member of the board of Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers cited in a periodical that the gasoline car dealers have branded the electric as a car for the aged and infirm and for women. And because this is a market they did not want themselves, we have accepted that. And we advertise and teach our dealers and salesmen to talk luxurious appointments, upholstery that matches gowns and livery, coach work and finish beyond compare, a past record for building carriages and buggies. We build up this atmosphere of ultra refinement and picture our cars in front of palatial residences and in private parks. It is all wrong, and we have deserved the false position in which we have heretofore allowed ourselves to be placed. Why create an impression that one must be a millionaire to own an electric? Well, largely because one had to be at the time. But had Henry Ford and Thomas Edison gone into production with their electric car in 1915, we'd have seen an entirely different sort of thing, I imagine, because he'd have brought his mass production sensibility and price sensitivity to the market. That didn't happen. So I do want to, just before I surrender the mic here, call out that the Studebaker and Milburn that we're going to hear about were not completely targeted at the high end of the market and did make an attempt to spread the technology elsewhere. But I'm going to surrender here and let the next speaker get on with the business.
Kevin, thank you. That was an excellent overview, and I think really provides a great opportunity to set the stage. Daniel Carpenter from the Tampa Bay Auto Museum is going to speak next. And Daniel, as you kick off, would you mind just sharing a little bit about yourself as well as the museum itself?
Sure. Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, John, for putting this together. Thank you for including us. The Tampa Bay Automobile Museum is located in Pinellas Park, Florida, right near the St. Petersburg area in Pinellas County. And we're going to turn 20 in this March. So March of 2025, we will turn 20. And we've been growing. Our collection is very full. In fact, we are out of space in the museum right now. We've actually got a couple cars listed for sale on our website. So if anybody's interested in maybe doing some browsing, you can do that there. But we were invited to participate today because we've got 4 cars of note for this webinar, 3 of which exhibit the gas electric technology. And then, of course, we have a fully electric vehicle. And I think what's especially noteworthy about the gas electric hybrid cars that we have 3 Owen magnetic cars. One is a chassis, and another one is an actual car, and then another one is a limousine. So you get a good idea as to what the versatility was, where they were going with the marketplace. And then, of course, our 1922 Milburn fully electric car. So I'm just going to take a little time to talk about each car individually. But in addition to having a very unique collection of cars at the Tampa Bay Automobile Museum, we focus on engineers. Our founder, Alan Surf, believed that the people who came up with these ideas and designed them and were innovators and forward thinking, that they should have tribute as well. So we're very pleased to highlight the people who came up with these ideas and got us to where we are with the automobile. So I'm also going to talk about a couple engineers in my presentation. So you want to go to the next slide for me? We've got this chassis, and this is kind of an interesting story. We acquired this in 2019, and we got it from a museum that closed, and it was just a chassis, and it was in very rough shape. And we spent about 2 years restoring it so that it would not only run, but that it would also be a functioning automobile. We put some temporary seats that really aren't so temporary now. We have the vehicle on display with the seats that we put in the car, and we had to do that just so we could test it and drive it around. And this, like all the other vehicles in our collection, it's tagged, insured, and drivable. This thing actually has insurance cards in case we decide to take it out on the road. And it's definitely a conversation starter for people because it gives them an opportunity to really see the technology. We have a plexiglass floor so people can see the inner workings of the car and just get a good idea of how that gas electric technology works. And a couple highlights here, but I think most noteworthy, less than 1,000 of these were made, and we have several of them in our collection, so we're very fortunate in that regard. You want to go to the next slide, please? This one is a barn find, which is people in automotive restoration know this is always a really neat thing when you're able to find something. This was in Alabama, and it was in basically the condition you see in this picture. We haven't yet started the restoration of this one, but this was a very nice car for its day. It was mostly made in Wilkes-Barre, and it was about $4,000 brand new. So this would have been a very nice car, also very advanced for its time. In particular, this vehicle has a 75 horsepower gas engine with a 24-volt generator and an electric traction motor. So this is very advanced, very sophisticated. This would have been a very nice car for its time, and we haven't started restoration on this one yet. But even just for the condition that it was in for a barn find, we were very pleased with that. But we do look forward to restoring it in the near future. Next slide, please. And here's our magnetic limousine, Owen magnetic limousine from 1916. Again, it's the gas electric hybrid technology. And this was one of the most expensive cars for its time. It was about $5,000 brand new. And this is exactly how we found this one. And this one is on display just as it is on the floor. And people really enjoy seeing it. One thing they often will comment is, oh my gosh, there's so much wood on this car. And we explain to people, not only was gas electric technology around over 100 years ago, but they also used wood for a lot of the body and a lot of the chassis work, and people are always kind of struck by that. And next to this on display, we have original 1916 dry cell batteries on display. We've got the cell and the batteries themselves, and people will often say things like, wow, it doesn't look very different than how it looks today. So this one's definitely a conversation starter for people as well. Again, only about 1,000 of these were made, and this one will be restored at some point, but we've got some other projects we're working on currently. So it'll be a little bit before we get to this one. We've also talked about maybe just keeping this one as is, just because of the condition that it's in, and it is very interesting to see. But this one, again, it was technologically advanced. It had a Continental inline six, and the generator supplies the power to the magnetic transmission. Very, very impressive technology. And this is all thanks to, you want to go to the next slide, please? This is all thanks to Justice Bulkley Entz, and really impressive, forward-thinking automotive engineer for his time. He was granted 75 patents over the course of his career. Some of the things that are very common now and were influential to the evolution of the automobile. And yet, even still, with all this, he wasn't commercially successful, and that's part of what we show throughout our collection and our museum, is that there were some very innovative, forward-thinking people, but circumstances, maybe they weren't the best of business minds, but for various reasons, they aren't in the same conversation as, say, Henry Ford. And this technology is absolutely a credit to just one forward engineer, thinking engineer, Justice Bulkley Entz, that we have on display and pay tribute to in the museum. You want to go to the next slide, please? And then this brings me to our fully electric Milburn from 1922. We acquired this in July of 2012. This car has been to Pebble Beach. It's been to Amelia Island. It's been to some very noteworthy car shows. But Milburn, I think, is a very fascinating story. You know, the largest wagon manufacturer. They then segue into the automobile industry, and they made a couple thousand of these cars. And you know, they didn't have the range of the vehicles that Kevin was talking about, but a top speed of 30 miles an hour. And President Woodrow Wilson owned one of these, and this one actually went around the White House grounds. And I've had the good fortune and opportunity to actually drive this car. And I've got the yellow line on the picture because if you look real close, you can see two almost broomstick handles standing up. And we love pointing out to visitors that, you know, this was the car that was marketed to women. It was a car for women because there wasn't a crankshaft start and there wasn't a steering wheel. And people are just fascinated by the fact that you would use two levers to operate a car. And what really struck me is even today, all these years later, when I drove it, it's quiet. It goes into gear real quick. And it was a little funky getting used to the levers at first, but you get used to it pretty quickly, and it was pretty easy to use. But it's definitely a good snapshot into what the industry looked like in the early 1920s. And of course, if you want to go to the next slide, this technology is all thanks to Carl Probst, another engineer that we like to highlight and pay tribute to at the museum. He joined Milburn in 1915, and he played a very important role in their cars up until the moment General Motors purchased Milburn in 19.
Oh, I think we just lost you. Oh,
So again, you know, forward thinking. They had a long career, and they definitely are influential contributors when it comes to this kind of technology and the evolution of the automobile. Next slide.
so Daniel, thank you very much.
And giving me the opportunity to speak on this.
Yeah, no, great job, and encourage anybody who's in the Tampa Bay area to stop by and see the museum. You'll certainly learn a lot. And we also want to thank Daniel because he is ending his vacation and he needs to now head off to the airport to head back home. So thanks for continuing to do this, and we look forward to visiting you in person.
Thank you very much.
And with that, it's a great segue into Sam Fiorani, who is from the Boyertown. He's a member of the board there, and he's going to speak about the Milburn that they have and just the connection with Milburn overall. Sam?
Thanks. I'm Sam Fiorani. I'm an automotive historian and board member for the Boyertown Museum of Historic Vehicles in Boyertown, Pennsylvania. The Boyertown Museum it is in a building that used to build carriages and truck bodies. The museum itself, the building itself, dates back 150 years, where it started building carriages and then it evolved into truck bodies in the 1900s and into the late 1900s. So they built vehicles into the 1980s. Starting in the late 60s, they experimented with electric vehicles. So we've got a collection of Boyertown-built vehicles and Pennsylvania-built vehicles, as well as alternative fueled vehicles. These are the main focuses of the museum. So right now we have vehicles dating from about 1912 through 1996 that are electric vehicles. Today I'd like to talk about the museum's Milburn and the Milburn Wagon Company. George Milburn was born in England in 1820. Following his father's death in 1835, his family immigrated to Canada. Finding work in the U.S., young George set out for Indiana in 1836. After marrying a Pennsylvania-born woman in 1941, the Milburns moved to a farm in Bone Prairie, Indiana, and the couple would have 6 children over the next dozen or so years. After relocating to a farm in Mishawaka in 1846, George opened a general store, and his success made him quite wealthy, and his business interests grew. He acquired a stake in the Mishawaka Wagon Works in 1853 and would buy out the whole company in 1858. In the late 1850s, Milburn won a federal contract to supply wagons for the 1857 Utah War, also known as the Mormon Rebellion. With just 100 people on the payroll, the company found it difficult to supply the full order, so Milburn subcontracted to a wagon builder 12 miles away in South Bend, Indiana, named Studebaker. Money raised over the next decade from this and the Civil War allowed both companies to grow into the 2 largest employers in the area. George's daughter, Anne, would eventually marry Clement Studebaker, the co-founder of Studebaker Brothers Wagon Company. The Wagon Works was incorporated as the Milburn Wagon Company in 1869. Milburn owned the Milburn House Hotel, in addition to farmland and the factory. His operation was growing, and Milburn helped form the Mishawaka Hydraulic Company, which helped provide water to local businesses for fire hydrants. Among his other local investments was the Oliver Plow Company and the Hollow Axle Manufacturing Company, which provided axles for rail cars and wagons. He even helped finance the construction of the Mishawaka ME Church. To keep his businesses growing, Milburn needed better access to the local rail line. He asked Mishawaka to help pay for improvements, but his proposal was defeated when a fire destroyed a considerable number of the downtown buildings in 1872. Milburn stepped up his search for an alternative location for the wagon works. Toledo, Ohio had a 32-acre property for Milburn and offered to purchase $300,000 of Milburn stock to lure the company. After some bad luck, including an economic depression in 1873, the new operation finally opened in 1875. Following George's death in 1883, his company continued to operate with branches in Albany, Nashville, Memphis, Batavia, New York, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in addition to the sawmill in Arkansas that provided the needed lumber for their wagons. Supplying wagons for the Spanish-American War added to profitable operations, which tallied more than 7,000 wagons per year. In the early years of the 20th century, Milburn added production of car bodies for the automaker for Oldsmobile, Overland, Pope, and Willis to the wagon business. Delivery truck bodies for the Model T were produced by Milburn and supplied to dealers. Business for the Ohio Electric Company was added in 1910. You want to flip to the next slide there? During negotiations to merge Ohio and Milburn, a rift between the F.H. Dodge and H.P. Dodge brothers, who controlled the 2 companies at the time, would have Ohio and Milburn parting ways. In 1914, Milburn introduced its own electric car. As a quick side note, Milburn spun off the Dura Mechanical Hardware division in the early teens. Dura patented the window lift mechanism that was used in Milburn electric cars, as well as various Ford, Dodge, Packard, and Nash vehicles. Dura is still in existence and currently a division of Magna International, the world's 3rd largest automotive parts supplier. To get the electric vehicle project off the ground, Milburn hired engineer Carl Probst to design the vehicle. Almost 30 years later, as it was pointed out, that Carl Probst helped Howard Christ put together the engineering designs for the American Bantam Jeep program. In 1914, Milburn introduced its light electric in the pages of Horseless Age. The company touted its experience in producing automobile bodies and said it found several men who had been prominent in the automotive industry to help manufacture and sell the new model. Focusing on the light 2,000-pound weight of the coupe, Milburn said it offered comfortable accommodation for 4 persons, and the upholstery was in high-grade French fabric. The article continued, with a battery equipment of 20 lead-acid cells and 180 amp hours capacity, it attains a normal speed of 17 with a maximum speed of 20 miles per hour. The rated mileage on a single charge is between 60 and 75 miles. A General Electric high-speed motor is used, and the controller is a General Electric's continuous torque non-arcing drum type, which affords 4 forward speeds and 2 reverses. Speed control and steering are arranged by means of conveniently arranged horizontal levers. A roadster and delivery wagon were also available. Early Milburns were popular, with production growing to 1,500 in 1916. Limited range, a problem with early Milburns, was solved in 1918 when battery swapping became a feature, where the tray was on rollers that operate on tracks. Simply roll out the discharged one and roll in a freshly charged set. It makes charging as easy as driving. Various body styles were offered, with coupes and bromes using tillers, while roadsters and sedans featured steering wheels. Limousines sported a steering wheel up front and a tiller in the back. As pointed out, President Woodrow Wilson had a Milburn, which he drove around the White House property, and Secret Service during the administration also used Milburns. We flip to the next slide, please. The plant was destroyed by a fire in 1919, but production resumed at Toledo University in January of 1920. By the next year, the company was valued at $1 million and had a workforce of 800, with a quarter of the workers making bodies for other car manufacturers, including Oldsmobile. That connection to General Motors, which led GM to purchasing Milburn plant in 1923 for $2 million. A year later, Milburn quietly disappeared. Can you see the next slide, please? This is the museum's Milburn Model 27L. It's a 1919 model. It has four forward speeds and 2 reverses. Powering the car is the 33 amp, 76 volt GE motor. It was the 147th Model 27L built and is believed to be the earliest remaining Model 27L. Of the estimated 5,000 Milburns produced between 1915 and 1923, there were reportedly known to be 55 still in existence. Just the next slide. Around the time of Milburn's demise, many other electric vehicle manufacturers were finding it tough to stay in business. Competing with internal combustion engined vehicles was difficult, especially after the invention of the self-starter. Electric vehicles at the time ran on DC motors, which were powered by heavy lead-acid batteries. This limited the speed of EVs, increasing their prices. Charging time of these early EVs was long and only provided enough energy to travel about 100 miles. And batteries had a limited lifespan, often requiring expensive replacements. Despite the short production run, Milburn is a significant part of the automotive industry and industrial history of the United States.
So, Sam, thank you so much for the overview. And as I said, thank you for loaning us your 1919 Milburn. We're grateful to have it here.
I invite everybody to Boyertown, Pennsylvania for a nice tour of our museum.
Yeah, please be sure to do that. I know that I owe them a visit and look forward to it. Okay, we are fully back. And actually, the presentation Sam did just dovetails very nicely with what Andy is going to be speaking about in relation to the Studebaker Company. So you'll find a very similar kind of approach and history. So let's see. Andy, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can. So
Wonderful, wonderful.
why not just share a little bit about the museum, where it is, and a little bit about your role, and then kick off from there.
All right. Yeah. I'm Andrew Beckman. I'm the archivist at the Studebaker National Museum in South Bend, Indiana. And as you may have guessed by our name, we have a lot of Studebakers in our collection. We have the surviving corporate Studebaker collection, which includes the vehicle we'll be talking about today, as well as some additional notable Studebaker models. Folks can check us out on the web at studebakermuseum.org, and also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And yeah, Sam's presentation dovetails nicely. In fact, he mentioned, as we say, the father-in-law, Mr. Milburn, Clement Studebaker, one of the founders of the Studebaker in all its iterations. It started as a 2-man blacksmith shop, the H&C Studebaker, the H for his brother Henry and the C for Clement Studebaker, in downtown South Bend in February of 1852. And also, as Sam covered, the Studebakers got a little helping hand from the soon-to-be father-in-law, when Milburn subcontracted in order from the U.S. Army in 1857. And those orders, and again, the parallels between the two companies are many. Studebaker continued to get some additional orders and grew rapidly to the point where Studebaker by the 1880s is building itself as the world's largest builder, the world's largest wagon factory in the world. And indeed, they were a global concern in an era of largely local and regional manufacturers for carriage and wagon making. They had outlets all over the United States. In fact, we see on the first slide here the automobile company, a subset of the actual Studebaker Brothers manufacturing company at this time. They show their offices in Cleveland, Ohio. But to look at the company's literature from the late 19th century, you're seeing outlets in every major U.S. city, from Chicago, Dallas, Philadelphia, Atlanta, San Francisco. And indeed, they were exporting vehicles globally as early as the 1881. We have a clip that Studebaker had just dispatched a shipload of wagons to a destination in Africa. So Studebaker really was dominating the horse-drawn era. But when it came time for the next mode of transportation to come in, Studebaker really had found itself in an advantageous position. They had a worldwide sales network. They had the name recognition. They'd been around for nearly 50 years by the time this newfangled contraption called the automobile is hitting the market. And Studebaker also was a little hesitant. And if you put yourself in the position of the Studebaker brothers, they had made all their money, become some of the wealthiest men in the state of Indiana, indeed the upper Midwest, by selling horse-drawn vehicles. And what do you do about this new thing called the automobile? And Studebaker executives, this is noted in the minutes, even recalled the bicycle craze of the early 1890s that went boom and went bust pretty quickly. Some were concerned the automobile would be the same way. Well, eventually Studebaker found, we're going to come down on both sides of the issues. They're going to keep manufacturing wagons and buggies and would do so until 1920. But they're going to really just kind of enter like a marketing arrangement between some of these companies and to see how this will take hold. And one of those companies was the EMF company. The F was the Flanders, which Kevin had mentioned the Flanders name earlier in his presentation, the Garford Company of Elyria, Ohio. But before gasoline-powered cars hit the market, Studebaker was jumping into the fray with electrics. So you see electric commercial vehicles. That's what we're talking about with our feature here today. But Studebaker also manufactured and offered a full line of passenger vehicles as well. And we have a couple of those in our collection in South Bend. J.M. Studebaker, for his part, declared gasoline-powered cars to be clumsy, dangerous, noisy brutes that stink to high heaven and break down at the worst possible moment. And frankly, when your name is on the side of the building, your executives tend to listen to you, and Studebaker indeed introduced their first automobile in electric in 1902. And we've heard some about Thomas Edison. Mr. Edison actually purchased one of the very early Studebaker automobiles. We have a promotional shot of showing Mr. Edison and his paymaster, George Meister, seated behind the tiller of a Studebaker electric. And there's a letter in our collection, too, stating that Mr. Edison apparently was quite fond of the Studebaker and held on to it, I believe it was, into the early 1920s. So whether that was maybe a test bed for some of his own ideas or he just found the Studebaker nice for tooling around the countryside in New Jersey there, we don't know for sure, but he apparently was suitably impressed with what the Studebaker company had to offer at this time. If we can move on to the next slide here, John. And Studebaker commercial vehicles, they offered several different chassis, all the way from light duty, like 1,000 pounds, up to massive capacities for the day. And of course, that's where really electric motors are, can handle a significant amount of power going through them and deliver instant torque. So certainly commercial applications were definitely an area they were looking into. We have a fleet. I'm trying to remember one of the New York City department stores ordered a whole fleet of Studebaker electrics for their use, I believe, as delivery vehicles. We even have a postcard showing a Studebaker electric serving as an ambulance for an elephant that had a leg problem for a traveling circus. There's no other vehicle could get the elephant to the veterinarian, but they managed to get it on a Studebaker electric and get it to where his leg could be cared for. Now, Studebaker as a manufacturer of commercial vehicles and even electrics in general, we're not talking great numbers. They produced a total of 1,811 electric vehicles of all kinds during their production run from 1902 to 1911. So they were never really big sellers, despite J.M. Studebaker's feelings to the contrary, that they were not the sales success that they were experienced with the gasoline-powered models of the later 1900s. But one of the most unusual Studebaker vehicles we have in our collection is one half of a pair of automobiles called backward forward cars. And when the new Senate office building was completed in 1909, there was a tunnel connecting the Senate to the Capitol building. And they wanted to be able to ferry senators back and forth from their offices to the Capitol. And they commissioned Studebaker to build a pair of automobiles for operation in the tunnel. Obviously, an enclosed space was not a gasoline-powered car was not going to work. And certainly a horse-drawn apparatus would have other downsides being in a confined space for that long. So 2 Studebaker electrics were built. They were nicknamed Tommy and Peg, and they remained in use until 1912 when a rail line replaced the automobiles. We can go to the next slide here. We see here the 2 now retired electrics, Tommy and Peg, and I believe that's Utah Senator. It's a senator from Utah, and his name is just out of my reading on the screen here behind the tiller. And these vehicles were called backward forward cars because there was no room to turn around in the tunnel, and these things actually have a turning circle of about 3 football fields. So what they did is they fitted them with dual controls facing each direction. So when you got to the end of the route, the senators were discharged for their vote. The driver would hop to the other seat facing the other way, flip the switch, and he could go back in the opposite direction. Now, as a driver, you had to have you had to pay attention because not only did you want to make sure the switch was flipped before you hit engage the power, but you were going from a front steer vehicle to a rear steer vehicle or the other way around, and obviously things would react very differently. So they certainly had to keep them on their toes. And you'll notice here the 2 vehicles are ostensibly identical, but not really. You'll notice the one on the left sits a bit lower than the one on the right. In the earlier slide, they actually had hard rubber tires, but apparently there were some complaints about the ride quality, so they switched to pneumatic tires shortly thereafter, and they used a slightly different size for whatever reason, and that's how we've been able to tell Tommy and Peg apart in the photographs. Can we go to the next slide, please? Well, when it came time to extract Tommy and Peg from the bowels of the U.S. Capitol and government buildings, thank you, Matt Anderson, Senator William H. King of Utah, I believe. Next beer's on me. Thank you, Matt. When it came time to remove the vehicles from the bowels of the United States Capitol building, it doesn't look elegant, but it got the job done. A whole bunch of ropes and blocks and tackles, and they got them out. And they were eventually sold off. One ended up, of course, with the Studebaker collection in South Bend. And if some of you are saying, gosh, I swear I've seen one of these somewhere else, indeed. Tommy is at the Swigert Museum, part of their collection in Pennsylvania. You know the next one here? We'd had Peg in our collection for a lot of years, and she had definitely seen some wear due to use and just a standard deterioration. These weren't exactly the best engineered vehicles from a longevity standpoint, but we received a Save America's Treasures grant back in early 2003, and we were able to conserve this and several other vehicles in our collection, which were designated as national treasures. And Peg and Studebaker, for its part, if something needed repairing or needed freshening, they did not hesitate. They'd take it down to the shops. They'd throw a fresh coat of paint on it, sometimes more than one fresh coats of paint, or do some rather hasty repairs to make sure it just held together. But the conservation work, can we go to the next one here, was handled by B.R. Howard and Associates in Wagoner's Gap, Pennsylvania. And they really did an exacting conservation treatment on Peg. And we can see here, you would have thought the color of the leather was actually the right-hand side, but no, after years and years of sitting out in the various buildings in questionable climates, it had taken on a color very different from what its original one. And B.R. Howard and their team were able to resurrect and really keep as much of the originality as possible. We can go next here. As I mentioned, the different paint surfaces over the years, just a simple cleaning was able to bring back some of the original hues, and there was some in-painting and other treatments done along the way to, again, conservation versus restoration. We were trying to save as much of the originality as possible. We can go out the next one here. And here we see the final, the after project right here. This is Peg after the conservation. See, she looks much nicer. The controls, for example, are not, the vehicle is not a hazard to itself and others. And after the conservation, we did not attempt the mechanicals at this point, but the fine folks at the Pennsylvania College of Technology, I believe it was Roy Klinger, spearheaded the effort to actually, they did work on Tommy for Swigert Museum, and they call us and says, hey, you know, we've got this all mapped out. If you'd like us, we'd be happy to come out and see if we can get yours running as well. We gladly took them up on their gracious offer. And this was about 2019. We can confirm that, yes, Peg is now runnable as well. The got her motors going and learned a lot about the operation. I think someone mentioned the 4-speed forwards and 2 speeds reverse. I believe that was Sam on mentioning that on the Milburn. What it comes down to on these is, yeah, this has a similar operation. It's just arranging the batteries, the power sources in a series and parallel circuits, and that's how you get the different speeds delivered or the different currents delivered to the motors, and that's how you actuate the speed. Now, I mentioned it is runnable. It is not yet drivable. The wheels and suspension, some other areas are going to definitely need some attention before we feel comfortable operating it on the street, but we are pleased that we are one step closer to hopefully that eventual goal. Yeah, there we see the before picture. And certainly a tip of the cap again to the folks at BR Howard and Associates, our pal Brian Howard and Jolene over there, and also all the folks at Pennsylvania College of Technology, and also the fine folks at the Keystone chapter, the Studebaker Drivers Club, who also were big supporters of the whole Save America's Treasures project. And I believe we have some members in the audience as well. Shout out to Kent Haberly, who said he was going to be joining the fray there. So, and that concludes my portion of the program, and I believe my pal Matt Anderson is up next. Excellent. Oh yeah, one last slide there, if I may, Matt. Yeah, we did actually have to do some recreation. Surprised to see some souvenir hunters made off with a couple of the Studebaker nameplates from Peg, so we did have to recreate some of those as well. But you'd be hard pressed to tell which one is the reproduction, which one is the original if you look at the carriage today.
Excellent. Andy, thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Yeah. And now Matt Anderson from the Henry Ford Museum will be sharing a story about Clara Ford and her electric vehicle. Matt, welcome, and why don't you just say a little bit about the museum and your work there?
Yeah, thanks, John. I appreciate the invitation to be a part of the panel. The Henry Ford was founded by Henry Ford in 1929. In fact, we just celebrated our 95th birthday a couple of weeks ago. And from the beginning, we've been a museum kind of dedicated to American innovation. And the two main components are Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation itself, where we look at not just technological change, but also social innovation and so forth. And then our outdoor open-air museum, Greenfield Village, where we have about 83 different buildings from about 300 years of American history. We are not solely or strictly an automobile museum, but that said, we do have about 300 cars in our collection. A lot of Fords and Mercurys and Lincolns, as you might imagine, but certainly not all. Even in Henry's time, he was collecting a little bit of everything. And my role there is as curator of transportation. So I look after the cars, the airplanes, and the railroad equipment. But we're not so much talking about Henry today as we are talking about Clara, his wife. And I wanted to just give a few highlights from her life. Much like her son Edsel, she's sometimes, well, often overshadowed by her husband. But Clara was born on April 11th, 1866, and got married, in fact, on her 22nd birthday, April 11th of 1888, to Henry Ford. A few years later, they welcomed their first and only child, Edsel Ford, who was born on November 6th, 1893. And Henry always referred to Clara as the believer. She had great faith in everything he tried. And of course, it turned out that faith was very well placed indeed. Henry had a great paying job as a chief engineer at the local power and light company here in Detroit when he decided to give it all up and go into the automobile business. And certainly Clara's faith was tested because Ford's first two companies completely failed, but third time was the charm with Ford Motor Company in 1903. And if you know the history of Henry Ford and Ford Motor Company, you know that Clara had this uncanny knack of always being there at the right time with the right advice. She helped him operate his very first gasoline engine, the kitchen sink engine, in December of 1893. She was there to urge him to purchase Lincoln Motor Company in 1922, which of course became an important core of the expanding Ford Motor Company empire. She was there in April of 41, convincing Henry finally to give in and recognize the UAW at Ford Motor Company. And then, maybe most importantly, sadly, Edsel passed away in 1943, and Henry decided he was going to come back and return as president of Ford Motor Company when, frankly, his physical and mental health was just beyond that being a good idea. But he did so nevertheless, and it was Clara who finally convinced Henry to step down in 1945 and allow Henry Ford II, their eldest grandson, to take over the company and, of course, basically rebuild, put together what had been damaged not only by Henry's physical infirmities, but also by the strains of World War II. So we have to give her credit for that. Clara passed away in 1950 on September 29th, just a few years after Henry had died in 1947. So we'll move to the next slide here and take a look at her car, Clara Ford's 1914 Detroit Electric. And you've heard a few things about this company already, but formerly known as the Anderson Electric Car Company, and perhaps I should say no relation to me, unfortunately, but they built about 13,000 cars from 1907 to 1980 or 1939, and arguably the best remembered and most successful of the electric car makers. Like Studebaker or Milburn, for that matter, they evolved from a carriage company, which had its own origins in 1884. Move on to the next slide here. Another sort of side profile of the automobile. Anderson Electric really catered toward women, as we've talked about, electric automobiles being cleaner, quieter, and just requiring less physical effort to operate. No crank to get the thing started, no gears to shift, no transmission to worry about. But they also marketed toward physicians, toward doctors. Of course, doctors making house calls at that time at any hour of the day, and they had the financial resources to pay more for an electric car. And the last thing you need when you have your doctor coming in an emergency is for him to break his wrist or his arm crank starting the car. So sort of made sense to target to that market. We'll go to the next slide here and add just some specifications on Clara's car specifically. And we should say this was the third of 3 Detroit electric automobiles that Clara had purchased and used in her lifetime. And for the same reasons as other women of her social standing purchased them, easier to drive and fitting of a woman of her means. You see there 54 cells, 108 volts in the battery array on this car. And if you know anything about Henry Ford and his long admiration for and friendship with Thomas Edison, you won't be surprised to know that they paid extra to get the Edison nickel iron batteries versus the standard lead acid batteries. And it was a considerable upcharge, about $600 to get those Edison batteries. But as Kevin had said earlier today, the Edison batteries had the advantage of being more durable. They had a longer lifetime. They could endure more charging and discharging cycles. The downside is they were more expensive, as we said, and they also didn't really hold a charge as well as lead acid batteries. But certainly the Fords were going to go for that. You see the speeds there. The car is operated by lever control, as we've seen in some of the other electrics, and there are 5 different notches or positions for that lever with speeds of about 5, 8, 13, 17, or 20 miles an hour, which is your top speed. And one of the reasons, if you buy an electric car today, you probably don't want to drive it on public roads because the slowest speed limit around here is 25 miles an hour. And as we all know, most folks ignore that limit, so it can be a little dangerous. Range anywhere between 50 and 85 miles, but electric car makers then, as they do now, always went with the best case scenario on that, assuming you were going to be driving in warm weather, going downhill all the way. So that 85 is probably a little optimistic. I'll just point out the wheelbase, 100 inches, which coincidentally is the same wheelbase as a Model T, but the weight on this car, 3,600 pounds, whereas a Model T is closer to 1,200 pounds. So a lot of that weight is in the batteries. And the price on this, $3,730, which works out to well over $117,000 today. So not an inexpensive car by any means. We can go to the next slide, take a look at the wood paneling, the door handles. Notice the monogram, the F there on the door. And it's worth noting that to offset the weight of those batteries, Detroit Electric used aluminum in a number of components. In the door panels, they were used in the fenders. Aluminum also used in the window sills and window sash construction, just to, again, cut down on some of the weight. Go to the next photo, and a close-up there of the door handle as well, which quite fancy. You also see sort of a more modern looking cylinder lock on there to lock the door on the car, which locking doors on your Model T wasn't much of a concern, particularly if you had an open touring car. So something a little different here in this vehicle. A look at the controls there, where you can monitor the charge and the amperage, and there's a Warner speedometer there you see on the right side. Then on the left side, we have a clock, interestingly, a mechanical clock, not an electric clock. Another shot here of the interior, and Anderson Electric, or Detroit Electric, I should say, advertised these cars as being roomy and luxurious on the interior, saying that there was space for 3 adults on this back bench without crowding. I will agree there's room for 3 adults. I will quibble with the description, no crowding. It would be a little tight. You'd want to be in with close friends. But you see the 2 controls there. The longer of the levers is the tiller for steering. The shorter is the actual throttle for adjusting positions. You see some buttons just to the left of the throttle, which control the various interior and exterior lights. And then the strap hanging on the window sash there, which is how you opened and lowered the window there. And both of those levers fold up out of the way so you can get in and out of the seat much easier. You'll notice too that the driver's seat is shifted a little forward of the passenger seats, again, to give the driver range of movement in operating those 2 control levers. The next shot there is a nice one of the 4th passenger seat in this car, which is up in the front, but it's located on a swivel. So the passenger riding there can either swivel to face backward and, I suppose, carry on a conversation with the passengers in the other bench seat, or swivel forward to see where they're going. But rather a novel layout, obviously, then, and especially now. And also, I want to point out the flower vase there just ahead of that chair, or above that chair. That itself was a $25 option, so you paid extra for that. But not only did it add a little bit of class and elegance to the interior of the car, those flowers were the functional equivalent of the ubiquitous pine tree shaped air freshener that we all have hanging from our rearview mirrors these days. Another shot of the controls there, and in the upward position, which again allows the driver to get in and out of the vehicle. Look at those batteries. And again, we mentioned these are the Edison style nickel iron batteries. They're a $600 option, but located in the front, what we would call the frunk today, I guess. Obviously, there's no engine under the hood, and then also in the trunk. So 2 different battery compartments just loaded full of these various cells. Yeah, we have another close-up shot here too. We do not operate Clara's Detroit Electric, but we do have a 1922 Detroit Electric, which looks very similar, which we do run from time to time. But wanted to show this letter from the Anderson Electric car company. The manager of sales there, you'll see, sent that to Clara Ford herself. And we have, I think if you click, there's a highlighted paragraph there, second from the bottom, as I recall, basically asking Clara if she might provide some names and addresses of her friends so that they could then reach out to them to sell additional cars to folks presumably of Clara's social status and, shall we say, economic power. So they didn't miss an opportunity. This is the card they enclosed, and note that Clara did not fill it out and did not return the card. Probably a bridge too far for the wife of the president of Ford Motor Company to do advertising or promotion for a competitor company, even if they were in a totally different price bracket. And then finally, I love this advertisement that Detroit Electric used, saying that Henry Ford and Thomas Edison buy Detroit Electric cars. The gist of the ad is that if you're looking for an electric car, what better model than the one used by the name in automobiles, Henry Ford, and the name in electricity, Thomas Edison. But the ad also mentions other automotive executives and leaders who were drivers of Detroit Electrics, including Frank Durier, who is about as close as you can get to an inventor of the automobile in the United States, with his brother Charles. James Couzens, who was treasurer at Ford Motor Company and sort of Ford's partner in getting Ford up and running right on up into the mid-19-teens. Also, Henry Joy, president of Packard, is cited as a owner and driver of Detroit Electric. And Howard Marmon, president of Nordyke and Marmon Automobiles. So Henry and Clara were certainly in good company, being owners and operators of Detroit Electric. But that was Clara's last Detroit Electric car, I should say. And clearly they held on to it and gave it to the museum, where it remains on display today as a part of our Great Stories exhibit, cars with interesting histories. And hard to get more interesting than the personal vehicle of Clara Ford's. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, great job. Thank you. It's a fun story. We appreciate you sharing it. So with that, we're going to open it up to questions, both through chat as well as anyone here in the audience. And so who would like to ask a question here? Anyone? The question from before?
Why did they have 2 reverse gears?
Yep. why did they have two reverse gears? Anyone from our speakers like to answer that? Other than convenience and speed differences?
I would like to, but I honestly can't. I'll throw it to my colleagues out here.
I don't have a good answer either. I think the answer is because they could. Yeah,
We have an answer, I think, from the audience.
great.
Back in that era, they didn't have any advanced electronic variable speed. Basically, the speed was controlled by either rearranging the voltage of the batteries or some resistor boxes, right? So you didn't have a smooth problem. So moving forward with that four of the speed from and in reverse to where it's because you have
So due to the lack of sophistication at the time, it was one of the ways to vary the speed. Okay, very good. Let's see what else. It's interesting, one of our chat is our friend from Spain is on today. So yeah. And so some comments about the amounts that 2250 in 1913 is equivalent to 70,000 and 5,000 in 1960 is equivalent to 143,600 today. Let's see. Do either of the Owen hybrid cars actually run? And unfortunately, Daniel had to take off, but I believe that they do run, but they are unrestored. And so I think they're on the list for restoration at the Tampa Museum.
I believe he said they were registered and insured, so that makes the connection that they might run.
Right, right. And then Kevin Wilson comments that Milburn was in Ohio, in the Toledo area somewhere. And here's a question. Batteries and EVs got less viable over time. Why? Would somebody on the panel like to discuss what was also happening in parallel with internal combustion engines and why that ended up being the dominant? Kevin, do you want to take a start at it?
Yeah, part of the competition between the technologies, well, just for a brief instance that I mentioned the Ford Edison project that got abandoned. The Edison batteries were really good at durability, which was a good thing, much better than the lead acid batteries of the day, but they were not particularly good at putting out a lot of energy at once. And that was a real deficit as internal combustion cars got much faster and more powerful and able to go much farther. We're still seeing electric carriages being marketed for city use with, speed capabilities of 20 miles an hour. Any decent Model T could beat that handily. And so there was also a bit of marketing and consumer expectation thing. The gasoline cars were sold, much as they are today, not so much on utility as on a sense of adventure and excitement. So where if you bought a gasoline car, you could expect to go out into the countryside and explore with a whole bunch of people. You might have a touring car with 7 or 8 seats. These electrics, when you got out in the countryside, there was no more electric lines. I mean, rural electrification was a big thing in the 1930s, well after electric cars had peaked and gone away. So there were a lot of factors into why they faded away. But like I tried to say in my presentation, a lot of it was they concentrated on a very small niche market, and nobody ever really seemed to try to match Model T like assembly line fast production. And
Electric vehicles were easier and cleaner in the early years, but then with the rise of the Model T, and then especially with the rise of the self-starter, they became easier for everybody to drive. Whereas an electric vehicle, as was pointed out before, were marketed towards women because hand cranking was dangerous and took a lot of muscle. And a self-starter was relatively easy because you could refuel a car very quickly and continue moving. When we got paved roads, it just made more sense to have a gas vehicle, whereas an electric vehicle could only travel up to 100 miles and then would have to sit for 8, 10, 12, 14 hours to charge.
I would add to that about the self-starter. Typically, historians and car enthusiasts will track that too. Oh, the first self-starter was the Cadillac in 1912. And that's correct. But the electric car industry was still growing at that time. They actually formed the Electric Industry or Association in 1913. But the writing was on the wall if you look backwards at it. And I think what really happened, I told an interviewer from the History Channel that the end was there in 1920, because after World War I, Ford made the self-starter optional on the Model T. So that was when everybody could afford a car that you could start easily.
It also didn't help that the Model T was so dirt cheap by 1915.
Yeah,
electric vehicles were so expensive.
Yeah, Model Ts cost less than the option cost of the the Edison battery in the Detroit Electric.
Yeah.
Excellent. We have a specific question for you, Sam. Could you speak about the auto car electric used by the newspaper in Philadelphia that you have in your collection?
We have a CT electric that was used by the publishing house in Philadelphia. I love that truck because it was built in 1912, and it was used apparently from 1912 to 1962 as an electric vehicle delivering paper from the rail yards to the print shop. And it only drove about 12 miles an hour, but still it delivered a ton of paper to, literally, it was a 1.5 ton truck. It would delivered paper from the rail yards to the print shop to publish the newspapers and magazines. It's prominently displayed in our museum, and we have a couple CT vehicles, but the 1912 is among my favorite.
Very good. Ted has a comment that his Detroit has 5 reverse speeds as well as forward.
Motors backwards, so it's not that difficult to use the transmission both directions.
Yeah, excellent. Greg asks, EVs started out at 200-mile range and then 100 miles per hour, but by the mid-teens was 85 miles and 20 miles per hour. Why is that? Sounds like a sort of basic battery usage consumption question. Who would like to take that?
As was pointed out, that the 200-mile range was at 12 miles an hour. And as vehicles started getting faster, that range is going to drop, as happens with any vehicle. But getting that much range is a special instance. They didn't typically run 200 miles on a charge.
Very good. Rob here asks, were a lot of the early individual batteries a single cell creating 2 DC volts each?
The cell output depends on the battery technology, the chemistry of the thing. I was just looking it up the other day again. The Edison batteries we keep talking about were said to produce 1.2 volts output, and you were supposed to watch that little gauge on the charger and stop at 1.7. Though someone else has answered that virtually all modern cells produce 2 volts per cell. I'm not enough of an electrician or electronics engineer to cope with the answer for that, but I do know that some of these Edison style batteries, that chemistry and construction, are still being used for storage at like solar panel facilities.
Very good.
And how those cells were needed to power one of those vehicles?
I think it was in Matt's presentation. How many were there in the Clara's car?
Yeah, Clara's car at 54 cells, 108 volts. So yep, two volts.
Yeah.
So there is a question for you, Matt, about you mentioned that Clara had 2 Detroits. Did she have any other electrics?
Yeah, and apologies if I misstated. She actually had 2 Detroit Electrics before the one that we showed today. So 3 total. She bought her first in 1908, coincidentally the year the Model T debuted. But to my knowledge, she didn't have any electric cars after that. She would have shifted to gasoline-powered automobile. Presumably by the 20s, she was driving Lincolns.
Ah, very good.
Or riding in Lincoln, I should say.
Right.
She was driving.
In our collection, we have a 1994, I believe, Ford Electric. So the electric vehicles started coming back in the 90s, and Ford was among the vehicles, the companies that had to build them in California, and we have one of those production Ford vehicles in our collection.
Yeah, I would reference also the fact that Kevin's book goes all the way up to modern day. So it is a complete history, and you can pick it up through Amazon or wherever you like. Yes, sir.
Original hybrids.
Yes. So the original hybrids, did they charge the battery while they were running? Unfortunately, Daniel's not here to answer. Does anybody else know that? I guess I'd be.
I'm just going to jump in. We have a wood dual power in our collection, 1917, and yes, it does charge the battery as you're operating the car, and it also has regenerative braking too. So
Does the wheels through the internal combustion engine?
It can, and then you switch over manually. The theory is you'd use the electric motor to get started and going, and then you'd switch over manually to the gasoline-powered car. So they both can power the wheels.
Okay, with just a couple more comments before we run out of time. Ray, did you have a question?
The deep pockets of the people that purchase these cars.
Right.
How difficult was it to change the batteries out? And would they have a whole different set somewhere because of the charge time? 6 hours, 8 hours, 11 hours.
Yeah. So the question is basically, given the wealth of these individuals, did they have multiple sets? How difficult was it to change the batteries in and out, especially given the amount of time it took to recharge the batteries? And so was that fairly common amongst the owners of these cars that they'd have backup batteries per se? Anybody on the panel know that?
I do know the Milburn had the ability to exchange batteries, but I don't believe that was a common practice across all vehicles.
Yeah.
No, but there were, going really back into the early EVs. Around 1900, there was a fleet of 250 taxi cabs in Detroit, New York, and they converted an ice arena into a battery swapping station, and the cab driver would pull into this place, and a lot of heavy equipment was developed in order to swap out the battery pack for one that was freshly charged, and they were on their way again. I think the range of those things was about 30 miles, but they were working all day long.
Okay. So Dr. Peter Zubritsky says the Matheson Auto Company went out of business. When they went out of business, the Owen Magnetic Company moved into the old plant in 40 Fort, Pennsylvania, and sold by the Matheson brothers. Building is still there, and owned by the Matheson Transfer Company. Hence named after the cars. The old McGee Auto Museum in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, had at least 2 and were auctioned off after the '72 flood when it shut down. Very interesting. And Jay Leno has one, and some would call it the first hybrid. Here's a question. Considering the weight, were there special EV tires and wheels back then, or did they use the same tire and wheels as gas car, which did not last as long as on gas cars? And I can say personally that that's true on existing electrics, where they last about 10,000 miles. And so one of the hidden costs of today, because of the weight, is that they wear out in about a quarter of the time that gas. But does anybody know if that was the same activity same phenomenon back then? I would assume it is.
I've seen the growth of EVs in the 1910s credited with some forcing some improvement in tire technology at the time, though they weren't all that reliable even on gas cars. So I'm not sure exactly where that goes. The other thing I noticed is that EVs ran on solid tires and wagon wheels some years after internal combustion cars had moved over to pneumatic tires. I guess it would apply as well to steam cars, which tend to be heavier than gasoline cars, at least in my experience.
Good.
The CT truck we talked about before has solid rubber tires, and that was 1912.
Yeah.
Okay. Given where we are time-wise, we'll ask one last question. Any information on the Cleveland electric car of 1900 built for Elmer Sperry, the designer? Anybody have any knowledge on that? Okay. Well,
There were some 5,000 vehicles built in the different brands built in the United States before World War II. So it's hard to be ready for everyone.
yeah. Very good. Well, once again, I want to thank the panel. This is a little bit unusual that we got 4 different museums included, and then in addition to our museum here, to be able to coordinate and share such great information. So thank you to all the presenters for all their hard work and for sharing their expertise. And we have recorded this, and so probably within a week to 10 days, we'll get it posted on the internet. So we hope that you'll check it out or pass it along to your friends. Rob, any parting comments?
No, we just want to thank everybody for their hard work and diligence again for joining us.
Yeah. So thank you all in the audience who were able to join us today. Rob has been the technical master behind all the work. And once again, I'd encourage you to pick up The Electric Vehicle Revolution by Kevin Wilson. It is available through Amazon. So thank you all, and we look forward to having you join us on a future webinar.
Great. Thanks for putting this together.
Thanks, John. That was a lot of fun.
Enjoy the weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.